I mean, that's what sharing is all about, right? Is not only talking about the achievements that have occurred, but also some of the struggles, and then in talking about the struggles, also hearing about how other people do it, but then also saying, hey, I was able to do it. And, even in the, even in, as you feel proud, allowing that pride to enrich your system at that time. And,
Hmm.
like we talked about in the, cultivating happiness and stuff like that. So it's like one thing leads to the next, then an emotion arises, and then we enrich that emotion, and then that emotion allows our body to
Hmm.
expand, or our energy to expand, or whatever that might be. And we just sort of enrich that moment, and we allow that
Right.
moment to inform ourselves, and
Yeah.
inform our being. uh, and it's not that we're holding on to it, but we're enriching it. So it's almost like
Right.
you take a musical note, and instead of just playing it and going dink, right, that you play it and you go
Hmm.
ding, right, and you just lengthen. It's almost as if you could take the moment and lengthen the moment, right? It's
Yes.
like, oh, let's lengthen this moment and just sit in it with that awareness, like just bathe in that awareness. And that is, in my opinion, sort of the basis of, neuroplasticity, and how we are redesigning our brain. And
Hmm.
every time that we do that, we um, we're triggering a new set of neurons, right? And we're triggering a new set of, I mean, how amazing is that, that in that moment, right, when you felt whatever it was, the pride or
Hmm.
whatever, that, hey, I can do this, right?
Right.
That triggered, neurotransmitters in your brain,
Hmm.
dopamine and serotonin and whatnot, naturally derived neurotransmitters from your own experience that were released, that caused then chemical reactions to occur in the neurons. And there's the reinforcement, right? There's the, now we bring attention to it, and then there's the reinforcement. And so when we're doing that, well, we're reinforcing those positive connections, those positive tracks, as opposed to always feeling like we're reinforcing, right? I'm coming out of my wallow. Yes, I'm there. I can be there sometimes, but now I'm sort of learning how to redirect that. And that's all, all that is part of the practice. The other important part of this is, um, at first at first we're trialing and error. There's trial and error, and we might not feel, let's say, this quote unquote successful in our practice. But then as we stick with it, we start noticing these small little changes, or what might, or, oh, I reacted to that a little differently, or I was able to respond to that, or whatnot. And then, um, this, what it does is actually, so it informs us in the present moment as we feel, oh wow, I was able to do that, right? There's a direction towards positivity. We enrich that, and so now we're actually enriching that moment. So we're taking that moment and extending it, almost like a musical note that we're, right? We are actively, consciously choosing to extend it, to extend the moment. I'm going to let myself feel this. I'm not holding on to it, right? Oh my God, I can't have anything. I can't feel anything else, because we know, because of the practice, that it constantly is changing. But if we give our attention to it, right? Just like if we give our attention to the stress or that negative thought that just came in, right? If we give attention to that, it's going to linger and grow, right? And then manifest in different ways, right? So as we're getting into these practices, and as these things happen, then we even if we see a tiny bit of light, right, in the middle of darkness, even if we see a tiny bit of light, we're going towards that. We just sort of say, oh, where am I directing my attention to? Oh, there's the light. Ah, let me put my attention to that. And then what happens is that the light grows, right? And so that's the power of doing all these practices and just kind of putting them together, as Annette was talking so beautifully. And then the other thing is that, we know that these moments are changing, right? But then having this experience and knowing that, hey, last time this happened, I was able to do this. It gives you then hope for every moment, sort of like, oh, I dealt with that moment. Well, here's a new moment that's arising. And here's another moment that's arising. Here's another moment that's arising. Here's another moment that's arising. Here's another moment that's arising, right? And so, oh, I was able to deal with that moment. Oh, yeah, I remember that moment, right? And so now you're actually using kind of the power of the mind and memory to then help you get through this next moment. Like, oh, I did that, right? And so it gives you a bit of courage and hope that, well, if I did every moment until now, well, maybe I can do every moment from now on. And you're like, oh, here's another moment that's coming up. And the sensory experience from that moment may not be pleasant, but we are learning how to be more present with it and how to really kind of expand that field of awareness to be able to, as best we can, hold all experience with sort of a loving, kind, non-judging awareness, and choosing to direct our attention, right? Choosing to direct our attention. And that, and I know I come back to this over and over again, but that is a huge part of this understanding, is choosing where you're directing your attention to, and knowing that your attention is going to be grabbed, that something is going to try to grab your attention. Knowing that, right? And yet having the power and the capacity to say, that is where I would like to pay attention to right now. Right. So I think that's, really, it's almost as if every moment of every day, and this is the part of the informal practice, right, where you can make a very powerful informal practice by asking yourself every moment of every day, what am I paying attention to, and do I want to be paying attention to that? Right? What am I paying attention to, and do I want to be paying attention to that? What am I paying? What is in my narrative? Right? What is going on in my narrative? Where is my attention being drawn to? And is that where I want my attention to go? Wow, I didn't think of that. So prior to this class, course, whatever you want to call it, it's the unlimited, undefined course. Maybe we didn't realize that we had so much capacity to choose where we could place our attention. And our attention just grabbed and grabbed and grabbed and grabbed and grabbed and grabbed and grabbed. And that's exactly what the world is trying to do. That's exactly what the world is trying to do. And like we said before, there's a power of attention. Right? There's a power of attention. Who's grabbing your attention? Where is your attention going? Who's grabbing it right now? What's grabbing? And that you choose, right? As opposed to letting the world choose for you. But all the ads, right, that are out, all the TV commercials, Well, we choose what we can watch on TV. Hopefully, we choose what we can watch on TV, but are we making that conscious choice? We can't choose the ads that come on, so that's grabbing our attention, right? We don't choose the billboards that we're paying attention to when we're driving down the street. We don't choose the we don't choose a lot of things, right? Oftentimes we don't choose the thoughts that are emerging in our head, or we think that they're so important that we talked about the Velcro, that we latch onto them, right? We latch onto them. Okay. So that's a huge part of, like, oh, I remember Ram Dass, mentioning that he was going through, I think he was in his, in his spiritual days, et cetera, et cetera. And, one of my favorite quotes of his is essentially, I just realized that there was just something more important to pay attention to. There was just something more important to pay attention to. Wow. So every day, every moment of every day, as you wake up and as you fall asleep, as you are falling asleep, as you are eating your lunch, what are you paying attention to? What are you paying attention to? And did you choose that? Was that a choice? Was that an active, conscious choice? Or did a thought emerge that grabbed your attention, and now you're off in Never Never Land, and that triggered another thought, another thought, another thought, another thought, and now you're thinking about something, and you're just sort of like, in mindless la la land. You're like, oh. Not that mindless la la land is bad, because it could be kind of fun. I'm in mindless la la land. All right. People might like La La Land. All right. His next paragraph, Jon Kabat-Zinn, next paragraph, as we continue going through mindfulness meditation for pain relief, is all on mindfulness-based stress reduction. Mindfulness-based stress. Mindfulness-based stress reduction started in 1979. 1979 at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. It's an interesting story of how it began. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is the program that Jon Kabat-Zinn started. It's an 8-week program. It's fairly intense. It has, I think, about an hour every day of formal practice. An hour every day of formal practice. And so it's pretty intense. It started in the basement of the medical center. At night, he went to all the department heads, and he said, I got this practice. It's called mindfulness practice, and I think it could help your patients. And everybody laughed at him, essentially. And he said, I do think it could help. And they're like, well, the only way that you prove anything in the United States is by doing research on it. And therefore, he started doing research on it. And they gave him the cafeteria. They gave him the space in the cafeteria at 9 o'clock at night. Sort of like when everybody went to bed. And what they let, and this was in the hospital, and so what they did is they let the patients who could like walk or ambulate or were in wheelchairs, who didn't need like 24/7 monitoring, to go to this practice. And what he asked all the department heads is, send me your worst patients. Send me your worst patients. You can imagine that, right? Send me your worst patients, the one who don't pay any attention to what you're saying, the one who don't follow any of your recommendations or orders or anything like that. And then, slowly, so he started doing this mindfulness practice with these people. And then slowly, they started seeing transformations. They started actually seeing change. And the department's heads came out and said, what are you doing? This patient who was always grumpy and yelling, was actually like paying attention and was reasonable and was this, and so there's actually change that even, some of the most hardcore 1979 department heads, right, cardiothoracic surgery and neurosurgery, et cetera, we're saying, yeah, we've actually seen some changes. And one of the first studies they did was actually looking at patients with chronic pain. And so mindfulness-based stress reduction has been used in chronic pain fairly consistently for many years, since the early 80s. And one of the first things they did is not only did it decrease pain levels, but it actually decreased inflammation. And so they were one of the first groups to take blood, to get your blood before starting mindfulness-based stress reduction class, and to look at inflammatory markers that were in your blood, and look at very specific like white blood cells and things called like interleukins or cytokines, very specific things, very like inflammatory, things. And literally noticed, after doing mindfulness-based stress reduction, that the inflammatory markers in people's bloods dropped, as did their experience of pain. And we know, right? We know that stress increases inflammation. We know that. It's a very well-known physiological mechanism. Right? Stress will increase inflammation. It'll increase cytokines and it'll increase inflammatory markers and stuff like that. That's why one of the main things we do in people with chronic pain is teach them, how to decrease stress. We have to decrease stress because we know that there's some inflammation coming from, let's say, maybe the injured tissue, but we don't want that inflammation to be exacerbated by stress. Right, so we want to teach stress reduction so that we're not causing the stress to increase the inflammation in the tissue. Right. And so very much decreased inflammation. We know that stress increases inflammation. So then, a program like mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? Mindfulness-based stress reduction, we're decreasing stress. They showed that, we can actually decrease inflammation. Right? It's one thing to show that you increase inflammation. It's another thing to show that you can actually decrease inflammation with the practice. Okay? A lot of you, I would say, have you ever done something where, for instance, you noticed that your muscles would tense, or your heart rate would increase, or you'd start sweating, right? Like you get nervous. Or you get, butterflies in your belly. And it's like, oh yeah. Okay, well, have you ever done something that can cause your heart rate to decrease? It can cause your muscles to relax. It can cause you to, right? And so if we can do one thing, we can do the other. If we can have a thought that causes us to be stressed or nervous. We can have a thought or an action that causes us to be relaxed and decreased. Right? Where most people are like, oh, yeah, I get these thoughts all the time and then I'm nervous. It's like, oh, well, can you do the other way around? No. Well, we can. Right. All right, for this meditation, I'm not going to actually use his words on this one because I am going to use something that I saw that I thought was it was a good reminder of this practice, and so I'm going to intertwine a little bit with that, and this comes from our friend Eckhart Tolle. We don't talk much about Eckhart, but he is a classic out there. All right. And, sometimes I see these quotes and I'm like, it's so genius, so simple. And so this is actually, so we're going to take this quote, and that's going to be our practice. Pay attention to the gap between two thoughts, the brief silent space between words in a conversation, between the notes of a piano or flute, or the gap between the in-breath and the out-breath. When you pay attention to those gaps, awareness of something becomes just awareness. The formless dimension of pure consciousness arises from within you and replaces identification with form. Okay, I'm going to read that again. All right, pay attention to the gap. So when we're in this practice, the gap is probably going to be the gap between two thoughts that you're having. Right, find the gap. It may be the gap between words that I'm speaking. If you're going for something external, that might be an easy gap. Or the gap between the in-breath and the out-breath. But pay attention to that. When you pay attention to those gaps, awareness of something. So what is the something? The something is the thought, right? Or the something is the musical note. Or the something is the word, right? That I'm speaking. That's the something, right? When you pay attention to those gaps, awareness of something becomes just awareness. The formless dimension of pure consciousness arises from within you and replaces identification with form. The identification with form is the identification with our thoughts, with our emotions, with our sensations, right? And what arises is pure consciousness, in essence, okay? All right. Okay, so let's pay attention to our posture and get into a comfortable posture. A posture we feel relaxed yet alert. Closing your eyes if you feel comfortable closing your eyes. If not, having a soft downward gaze as you're gazing off on the horizon over a sunset, the ocean, a valley. And allow your body to feel supported by whatever surface it's on. And taking 2 or 3 deep breaths, and with each in-breath and out-breath, seeing if you can release any tension in your body that's felt, even if it's just the intention of releasing. And bringing your attention to your resource, your anchor, whatever that might be. And noticing as your mind wanders to come back. To your anchor. And from this space of being anchored and resourced and knowing that you have a place that you can direct your attention to if you wish, paying attention to the gap. Whatever gap there is that comes to you. Could be finding the gap between two thoughts. It could be listening for the gap between my words. It could be finding the gap between your breath. Whatever it is, finding that gap, paying attention to it. And that's it. Let's see what happens. Where's the gap? Just as Eckhart says, paying attention to the gap. Let's see what happens. And if it gets too difficult, or you're trying to find the gap, just allowing yourself to rest back in your resource, rest back in your anchor. Finding the gap, paying attention to the gap, the space. What remains between two thoughts? What is the space that emerges between two thoughts, two breaths, two words? Finding the gap, paying attention to the gap. And just noting where you are. What is your present moment experience? And coming back to your anchor, coming back to your resource, directing your attention, taking 2 or 3 deep breaths again. Opening your eyes if your eyes were closed. Reorienting yourself to your room. And just noting how that experience, how that meditation was for you.